You are trapped in your shadow. Yes, you. You are trapped in a psychological prison that you yourself built, shadow by shadow. With every part of yourself you've disowned, with every negative aspect of your personality you've hidden away, with every uncomfortable truth about yourself you've refused to acknowledge. Do you feel that heaviness in your psyche? It's not anxiety, it's not stress. It's the unbearable weight of a fractured self, a self divided between what you present to the world and what you've banished to the darkness, a self designed to please others, to fit societal norms, to avoid confronting what Jung called the shadow. Do you know what is the cruelest thing? Nobody asked you to make that sacrifice. Nobody asked you to fragment your psyche, to exile parts of yourself into the unconscious. But you did it voluntarily. You chained yourself to collective expectations, selling your wholeness in exchange for conditional acceptance, for momentary approval. And now that you look inside, what remains of you? What part is authentically yours? And what part was shaped by fear, by insecurity, by the sick need to fit into a world that demands conformity at the cost of completeness? They made you believe that suppressing your shadow was the key. They sold you the illusion that if you managed to hide away every bad part of yourself, your anger, your selfishness, your darkness, everything would turn out well. Everything would be perfect. Do you want to know the truth that nobody dares to tell you? Absolute shadow repression is a lie, a psychological trap designed to keep you fragmented, distracted, disconnected from what really matters. The more you obsess over hiding your shadow, the more you slide towards anxiety, towards silent desperation, towards a life that you never finish living because you're always busy maintaining a facade that drains your vital energy. Have you ever wondered why you feel that inexplicable void despite apparently having it all? It's because what you have isn't really yours. Your relationships, your achievements, even your conscious thoughts are contaminated by the shadow material lurking beneath. And the more you seek to appear flawless, the further you drift from your center, from that true integrated self that you once knew how to recognize, but that now you barely remember. Carl Jung, from his contemplative practice in the early 20th century, saw clearly what today you don't want to accept. That shadow integration is not self-destruction, but the only path towards true psychological freedom. He understood that we live trapped not by external circumstances, but by our sick attempt to control the uncontrollable parts of our psyche, by our obsession to appear wholly good, to fit in, to avoid confronting our darkness at all costs. But what if I told you that the shadow you so fear is precisely the key that opens the door to your freedom? What would happen if for a moment you dared to look at those aspects of yourself you've buried so deeply? That anger, that jealousy, that selfishness you pretend doesn't exist? That shadow that you believe would destroy you, but that in reality is slowly suffocating you by remaining unacknowledged? Because here's the paradox. The more you try to repress your shadow, the less integrated you actually are. The more you seek to appear purely good, the less authentic you become. And the more you resist shadow work, the stronger your shadow grows when it inevitably emerges in projections, dreams, and destructive behaviors. The psyche does not function under your conscious control alone, and it never will. Accepting this is not weakness, it is wisdom. The unconscious, in its mysterious depth and unpredictability, demands something very simple but terrifying: to be acknowledged. Acknowledge your shadow. Acknowledge your capacity for rage. Acknowledge your selfishness. Acknowledge that false identity you've created to protect yourself from others' judgment. Imagine for a second what would happen if you stopped trying so hard to be only your good self. Who would you be without that constant repression? What would you do if you knew you could integrate all aspects of your being? That person you see in your mind right now, that version of yourself who lives without psychological compartmentalization, is who you really are in your wholeness. But there's something darker. something deeper behind this uncomfortable reality. And it's that you fear integrating your shadow because deep down, you don't know who you are with those repressed aspects returned to consciousness. You're afraid to discover that your identity has been so diluted, so fractured by shadow repression, that upon letting those parts back in, maybe your self-concept would collapse.
But here's the liberating and brutal truth that Jung illuminated centuries after Montaigne. By integrating what you are not conscious of, for the first time you can clearly see what you truly are. The psychological freedom you seek is just on the other side of the fear that now paralyzes you. It's not in a self-help book, nor in motivational advice, nor in any mystical secret. It's here in this precise moment, waiting for you to have enough courage to face your shadow and say, I no longer need to hide from myself. I no longer need to exile parts of who I am. I no longer need to pretend to be only light.
Now tell me, are you ready to begin shadow work, or will you continue clinging to a fragmented existence, knowing that each day that passes takes you further from psychological integration? This is just the beginning of a journey that you may not want to make, but desperately need, and the decision is solely in your hands. Will you live trapped in a gilded cage of partial consciousness built by yourself? Or will you accept the risk of diving into the unknown, into a psychological freedom that may terrify you but that ultimately makes you feel alive and whole? Welcome to the practice of shadow work, to the pursuit of inner integration that will change absolutely everything you thought you knew about yourself. The path is unsettling, but I assure you, the only thing more terrifying than moving towards that wholeness is staying exactly where you are now. You have been convinced that maintaining your persona, your social mask, is the most important thing. But what would happen if you discovered that most of that facade was never really authentic? All your life, you have been striving to live up to ideals that collective consciousness built, without ever questioning whether those ideals denied essential parts of your humanity. And now that you are so invested in that persona, what do you see? The fulfillment you dreamed of, or just the distorted reflection of what someone else wanted you to be? We are obsessed with the idea of appearing good, believing that achieving certain social standards will finally give us peace. But have you ever wondered what exactly goodness is? And more importantly, at what psychological cost does it come? Perhaps you have already achieved several of those standards that were supposed to make you whole, being seen as kind, generous, controlled, rational, and yet you feel that something is missing. That feeling, that uncomfortable truth that wakes you up at night, is your shadow demanding to be heard. Jung discovered in his deep exploration of the psyche, away from the illusions of persona, something revealing and dangerous. That true psychological health looks nothing like what society sold you. It is not the absence of darkness, not the rejection of uncomfortable emotions, not even constant positivity. True psychological integration, the one few dare to pursue, is living fully aligned with your complete nature, both light and shadow. But of course, for that you have to know who you really are beyond the mask, beyond the expectations, and beyond that false version of yourself that you present to the world every day. You have become so accustomed to repressing your shadow that you don't even notice the immense effort you make daily to sustain an image that doesn't represent your whole self. But the unconscious is relentless. Even if you try to ignore it, there will always be something within you that rebels, something that sooner or later breaks through in projections, in dreams, in slips, in seemingly inexplicable emotional reactions. Want an uncomfortable but liberating truth? As long as you continue hiding from your shadow, you will never know true psychological peace. The stress, the anxiety, and the constant feeling of emptiness are simply the logical consequence of a life lived in fragmentation. But here comes the tricky part, and Jung had it clear. Most people prefer the security of a divided psyche before the risk of facing the uncertainty of integrating their shadow. They prefer to continue with a half-life, settling for crumbs of psychological comfort rather than facing the risk of discovering their complete selves. And you, which group are you in? Are you one of those who assume the risk of finding your shadow, or one of those who prefer to remain comfortably numbed by repression? Because yes, repression is a very effective anesthetic. It keeps you busy, distracted, trapped in a repetitive cycle that slowly numbs your capacity for wholeness. But what you don't see is that this apparent security comes at a very high price: the total loss of your psychological integrity. And integrity, although many confuse it with moral perfection, is actually something much deeper. Integrity is having the courage to be true to your whole self, both light and shadow, even if that means challenging expectations, breaking patterns, and sometimes disappointing those around you who prefer your persona to your authentic self. Perhaps at this point you think, what if by integrating my shadow I lose everything I've achieved so far? And here's where another paradox appears. If you really need to repress essential parts of yourself to maintain what you have, then it was never truly yours in the first place. True relationships, the projects that really matter, the achievements worth keeping, survive perfectly well with authenticity. On the contrary, only by being authentic, by integrating your shadow, do you discover what really matters and what was simply taking up psychological space. In reality, you have much less to lose than you imagine, and much more to gain than you believe. But of course, you must first take the leap, that leap into the unknown, into a life where your shadow and your light coexist, but that at least will truly be yours. And here again comes the central idea of Jung, reminding us that shadow work does not mean being consumed by darkness, but understanding that only from psychological wholeness can you love and create genuinely. Everything you possess from repression and fragmentation ends up possessing you. Here's the message no one tells you. Most live in fear of their shadow because they've never allowed themselves to discover what would happen if they acknowledged it. They cling desperately to partial selves, to comfortable self-concepts, to prefabricated identities, and in that effort, they forget that real life begins right when you stop denying what makes you wholly human. So what are you going to do now? Will you continue living by psychological inertia, afraid to discover your shadow? Or will you finally have enough courage to let go of the familiar repression and launch yourself into the uncertainty that terrifies you but holds the possibility of discovering something much more valuable, who you really are in your totality, beyond the masks, beyond the fear? This is the path Jung walked through his own confrontation with the unconscious, and it is the same path that now lies before you. Will you dare to walk it, or will you settle for continuing to be a spectator of your own fractured existence? The answer is yours alone. Following that line, we can explore how shadow work is not only a vehicle for psychological health, but also a deep mirror of our search for authenticity. When we confront our shadow, whether consciously or unconsciously, we position ourselves in front of the reflection of what we are in our entirety. Shadow integration then becomes a powerful tool for self-exploration, where each aspect we've disowned projects our deepest fears or our most hidden potentials. We often forget that the shadow is also a way of encountering life, a kind of emotional repository in which we've placed multiple parts of ourselves we deemed unacceptable. Therefore, in times of personal crisis or transformation, shadow work becomes even more relevant. It offers both challenge and catharsis simultaneously, but beyond comfort, it also allows a boldness that we seldom dare to show in our everyday conscious reality, inviting us to transgress imaginary limits and explore radically different aspects of ourselves.
And here comes a fascinating point. How much do the shadows we refuse to acknowledge influence our daily decisions? Perhaps the unconscious material we cultivate internally determines how we interpret external reality, filtering our experiences and invisibly but constantly shaping the course of our lives. Thus, the power of shadow work is not only psychological or analytical, but intimately personal, capable of transforming our present and future from the aspects we choose to integrate rather than repress. This leads us to an even more provocative question. What if confronting the shadow we carry was a way to rewrite our destiny? It's not far-fetched to think that many people live trapped in inherited patterns that don't entirely belong to them. Stories of failure, limitations, imposed roles, and yet accept them as unmovable truths. In this sense, reclaiming one's own shadow can be a profoundly revolutionary act, rewriting ourselves not just as one-dimensional characters, but as complete beings with agency, capable of resignifying the past and projecting different futures. Moreover, there is an intriguing phenomenon. The shadow we integrate not only affects how we act, but also how we relate to others. A well-integrated psyche can become a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, influencing our relationships, our opportunities, and the way the world responds to us, as if the internal integration were a silent script that we all unknowingly help to perform. Thus, consciously undertaking shadow work is not just a matter of introspection, but also a life strategy. On the other hand, we must consider the role of contradiction within the shadow integration process. We are not linear beings, nor should our psychological work be. Embracing that a rich human experience includes dark zones, changes of course, contradictions and ambiguities is embracing the human in its entirety. Indeed, the most integrated people are not those where everything appears perfect, but those who acknowledge the full spectrum of their humanity, the light and the dark, the conscious and the unconscious.
It is in that integration where the beauty of wholeness, and therefore of life itself, lies. And perhaps the most poetic of all this is that we never stop integrating ourselves. Every confrontation with shadow material, every acceptance of a disowned part, every moment of honest self-reflection adds a dimension to our wholeness.
We are perpetual works in progress. Sometimes conscious, sometimes not. Every decision to face our shadow, no matter how small, is sculpting a new version of our complete self.
And if you've read this far, you may have already realized something powerful. We are not victims of our shadow. We are potential integrators of a complete psyche. And the fascinating thing is that there are no final versions of ourselves. Every day can be a new opportunity for shadow work. Yes, but also a day that transforms the meaning of your previous experiences. What yesterday seemed like a shameful shadow aspect, today can be recognized as the source of your greatest strength.
And that, perhaps, is the great alchemy of shadow work, turning disowned aspects into recognized strengths, repressed emotions into conscious power, denied capacities into creative expression.
But beware, because here comes the final twist. What if the true art of living was not knowing exactly what shadow still awaits integration? Because in the ongoing journey, there is also beauty. In not knowing whether you are confronting your last shadow or just beginning the real work, there is an almost magical potential. Sometimes the most powerful transformations are not those that close with a definitive integration, but those that leave you wanting to continue the work because it's not over yet. And now we have come to the end. Although you know that endings are also disguised beginnings, if any of this resonated with you, subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss the next chapter of shadow work. And leave me this phrase in the comments: I integrate my shadow. That way I'll know you made it here and that you are part of this community of conscious, curious, and brave shadow workers.
See you in the next episode, where you might not have all the answers about your shadow, but you will definitely come out with better questions. Until then, close this chapter, but don't put the work away, because the next shadow you integrate could change everything.